Welcome to the New Europe studios, where you can watch us make the news. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Gunther Nooke, who's the African special representative to the German Chancellor. Is that correct?
Yes, the personal representative of the German Chancellor for Africa. It was an appointment 10 years ago by the heads of state of G8 countries.
Okay.
And so I'm a special envoy.
A special envoy, and you come into this with a record in working in human rights before this position. Now, after 4 years in this role, what changes have you seen in Africa? And I ask you this because the Africa that many people have in their heads is not the Africa that actually exists in the real world now. So, what have you noticed?
The best approach to understand and to tackle Africa is to be aware that that is a continent, and the continent is much more diverse than Europe it is. And so we have to see that there's a lot of changes. It has taken place so many different developments, so 54 different countries, different regions, more than 2,000 ethnic groups or different languages. So we have to see that Africa is a very interesting, diverse, big, large continent. So that's the first sentence. The second is the debates has been changed from development assistance, development aid to private investment, FDIs in Africa. There are very prosperous cities. One of the biggest and most vital developments we have seen in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Yeah. But on the other hand, there is a very strong industrialized region in South Africa, which has not developed so fast compared to other new strong partners in Nigeria, in Kenya, but also countries like Mozambique, Tanzania. The last developments we have seen were driven more or less by the use of raw materials, of minerals, of oil and gas. But on the other hand, of course, there is a very interesting development in the ICT sector.
Yes,
mobile phones and the smartphones, the tablets, that also will change the continent in the future. I'm very convinced of this.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, the old line, Africa is a continent, it is one that keeps reappearing. There are in fact a couple of internet groups that capture all these errors when people keep referring to it as though it is. You know, you've got high ice-clad, glacier-covered mountains, you've got the world's largest desert, you've got enormous river systems, enormously large cities, and tiny, small, scattered villages as well. And of course, with a mixture of so many different geographies, so many different cultures, and so many different nations, it really is an incredible patchwork for us all to work with. But I also noticed one thing that you said, which I think sums up very succinctly the change. We are moving away from being a recipient of aid to being a recipient of trade and of business.
I think we here in Europe, we have to be aware of Africa as our neighboring continent. It's our partner. The Mediterranean is more a linkage for us than that it is a border, and we have to see that not only north of Africa but the whole continent is interested in Europe, but maybe Europe and many European countries are not interested enough in Africa.
And I think, you know, when we're talking in Europe about growth, some of the growth rates in Africa are really quite phenomenal. And also, as you mentioned, there's also the beginnings of a change where Africa was seen almost as like an open cast mine for Europe. It was a place where we got raw materials. But now they're beginning to really turn the corner and really become a manufacturing centre as well. What changes do you see in that area?
Of course, the processing of raw materials are very important, but it's difficult to attract private companies on industrial sites in Africa to produce raw materials or products in Africa. The processing of food and minerals, it's a very sophisticated business, and so we have to see that one issue we have to discuss, and what the African side has brought up, is the continental free trade area, for instance. The 54 countries are relatively small in Africa, and we need a bigger market for economic prosperity and better trade environments, infrastructure, border control, border barriers, so that there is a bigger market for goods in Africa produced on the continent.
I think also, what we've seen in some of the better performing economies and governance is another area where we've seen great strides of improvement in large parts of Africa. But what we're seeing is, as we move to more trade, we're moving to more stability, we're moving to a better life for millions and millions of people, and we're also working on something where there's a better relationship and deeper relationship between Europe and Africa, which is a centuries-old relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, but the relationship has changed.
Yes.
In the beginning, the colonial period was really dangerous and a catastrophe for the continent. Yes. But on the other hand, also the period of the Cold War has had a very strong and negative impact on the continent, where the Western countries had their own dictators on allies on the continent, but the socialized system, the Soviet Union, has also their counterparts and dictators on the continent, and both were donated by a big Cold War superpowers, and the development in Africa has started after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, and now we have 25 years later, and we can see that there is an inherent and endogene growth and development on the continent, and that is a very positive sign. But we have to foster all these different developments. Of course, crises, civil wars are not over.
No, there still are a lot of problems involved in Africa, and no one is denying that. But I think what you're saying is very important, in that the continent has changed because we've changed, and we've changed how we approach Africa, and it follows from that Africa is also improving. So what's good for Africa is also good for us.
Yeah, of course. We can benefit from each other, and that's really important, that Europe use this interest of African partners in the European market, that we can also use Africa to help them in producing agricultural products, food. The food security issue is relatively easy to solve with own production on the continent. It's a green continent. It's not only a kind of drought and desert region. It's really a very vital and green continent in many of these areas, and you can produce flowers there. For instance, in Germany, I have heard when I visited the biggest rose farm in the world in Ethiopia, that 90% of the 2 million roses per day are going to German supermarket chains.
And let's hope that some of these roses are also being given as gifts to our loved ones in home as well. I mean, just to ask you one final question, because the importance of Africa means that you're in much more demand than perhaps you were even just 4 years ago when you come into Brussels. We've got the enormous EU-Africa summit, and the size of this summit says something about our relationship with Africa strengthening and deepening. What are you hoping, very briefly, to get out of this summit?
I think we need a positive signal that Europe and Africa want to walk together the next 10 years, the next 20 years as neighboring continent, as partners, as business partners, and of course also that we are interested in solutions of Africans, that they deal and tackle their own issues themselves, not only peace and security issues, but also all the others. We are interested in good governance, in rule of law, and of course that are the environment that German or other businessmen need to invest in Africa. I think knowledge transfer, new concepts for education, for universities, the ICT sector, information communication technologies, that's very interesting. We have seen this development in Kenya of M-Pesa. There are also new technologies, new ideas which come from Africa and are interesting for other regions in the world and also for Europe maybe.
Well, thank you very much for your time. As we can see from this, is if we can educate ourselves a little bit more about what Africa is becoming and the changes that are going to take place beyond that, our partnership can deepen, and certainly on trade, because Africa, if nothing else, is a continent of natural entrepreneurs. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.